I'd like to pose a question for you to consider. How would you be different if you had grown up in a culture other than your own? How might you be a different person if you had grown up in a country other than your home country? You know, the culture in which we are raised shapes us more than we probably realize. Every culture is different, and so growing up in a particular culture has a definite impact upon our worldview, the way that we look at life, and the way we respond to it. And if you've lived a very multicultural life, I'm sure you realize what I'm talking about. Many Americans, however, have not had the opportunity to experience various cultures. Americans are a generally mobile people, meaning that they tend to move somewhat frequently. But this being the case, it doesn't necessarily mean that most Americans get exposure to cross-cultural opportunities, as some might think. To show this, I've analyzed the data from the 2000 U.S. Census in regards to moving habits of Americans. And this chart shows moving patterns for Americans for the years 1999 and 2000. Now, during these years, the U.S. Census reports that 43 million U.S. residents, that is 16% of the population, moved during that time. However, as this graph shows, in the green, 56% of those moves were within the same county. 20%, shown here in the purple, were moves to different counties within the same state. Shown in the orange, 19% of people moved to different states, and only 5% moved to a different country. The reality is that many Americans receive very little, if any, exposure to the world outside of the United States. And while there can be great benefits to growing up in one culture, I believe there can also be some particular drawbacks. For example, let me read to you an article published in 2005 by Yale University's online magazine. This article is titled, "Americans Are Tuning Out the World." And let me read you what the magazine reports. It has long been known that fewer Americans have passports, and U.S. citizens travel less than their counterparts in other developed economies. And while a record 21% of all Americans now have passports and are traveling more, the number going overseas in the past 20 years has grown at a slower rate than the number of overseas visitors to America or the growth in international tourism in general. And indeed, during the late 1980s and early 1990s, the number of Americans applying for a passport declined for the first time in several years. Now, this article concludes by saying that Americans are becoming relatively less, not more, engaged with the world in general. And I believe that this is not healthy, particularly for us as Christians, as disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ. I believe there is immense value in being engaged with the world. You know, I grew up for 8 years in the Philippines, and I realized that there can be some certain difficulties to multicultural experiences, but I believe that they can be of immense value. Now, it's probably unfeasible to expect every American to be able to live overseas for a number of years, but I believe that it is reasonable to encourage every American to gain at least one overseas travel experience. Right now, I'd like to share with you 3 reasons why I believe that such an experience can benefit you and strengthen your relationship with God. Firstly, traveling overseas will make you more appreciative of the blessing we have here in the U.S. And I'm speaking about both material blessings and spiritual blessings. There are more grocery stores and more restaurants within 3 blocks of my house in Virginia than in my entire town back in the Philippines. I remember when I first returned to the U.S. after living overseas, and I went into a CVS pharmacy because I had to get a prescription filled. Now, a pharmacy in the Philippines is a small shack on the side of the road. You walk up to the counter, hand them the prescription, they give you the medicine. And I realized that here in the U.S., pharmacies are at least air-conditioned and indoors, but I was still not prepared at all for what I saw when I walked into that CVS. Because when I walked through those automatic doors, I was shocked, and I could not believe the amount of food that I saw. And this CVS was right next to a grocery store, but this CVS had more food in it than the biggest grocery store in my town in the Philippines. It's hard to explain how shocked and how amazed I was at the abundance of food, most of it junk food. And that's just the food that we have. Think about the cars that we drive here. You know, you might not realize it until you leave the United States for a little while, but the cars that we drive here in the U.S. are huge. I mean, almost everyone I know drives an SUV. They're everywhere on the road. Most overseas